Hi everyone, and thank you for attending my talk on intersectionality, Latin literature, and Plautus' Poenulus. Like Asia just gave a very quick background on myself, but my name is Antonia Aluko. I'm currently completing my MA in Classics at Royal Holloway, where I also completed my BA in Classical Studies. Today I'll be sharing my MA thesis on intersectionality in Plautus' Poenulus with some overtures to other intersectional experiences that I've noted in Latin literature. So first of all, let's delve into intersectional theory. I first discovered intersectional theory in the final year of my bachelor's via the work of Audre Lorde. As a Black gay woman, her work really resonated with mine, my own experiences, as I often felt disenfranchised from the communities that I'm meant to be a part of. For those of you who aren't familiar with this concept, intersectionality pertains to the idea that a person can have and experience layers of difference or marginalizing characteristics that exclude them from society and each of those distinct groups. In modern terms, some examples of this is the hidden homophobia and sexism and misogyny that exists in the Black community, or the racism, homophobia and transphobia in the early feminist movement. Although each of these distinct groups face discrimination, they ostracize others who have different marginalizing characteristics, and these pushes those individuals further into the realm of the other, and it pushes them into feeling like they can't belong into those distinct groups. Intersectional theory understands that you can be discriminated against by a member of a marginalized group because of how one characteristic is valued above another in society. For example, this can clearly be seen in the Black community, as Black cis men still benefit from the patriarchy, even though they can be discriminated against because of their race and ethnicity. Intersectionality then is useful in considering others as multifaceted beings who cannot be simply identified through a singular mode of difference. So my critical framework emerges from the thoughts of Audre Lorde, Kimberly Crenshaw, and Sylvia Wynter, and Shelley Haley. In particular, Haley outlines that trying to reclaim the classics for these marginalized groups is vital in decolonizing ancient texts for modern readership. This process of decolonization is crucial for the field to thrive when issues of social justice lie at the heart of so much public debate. The intersectional methodology created by these theorists' experiences creates a framework for exploring other intersectional experiences, even if the axis of oppression may be different as we're looking at the Roman world today. Each of these writers as Black women have intersectional experiences and thus write about lives on the outside of society. So a lot of this work is being done in other fields, but in using these theorists, my methodology will demonstrate how intersectional theory can be used in the classics. I'd just like to read out two quotes from Crenshaw, which I think is quite essential to this project. The first being, intersectionality is a lens through which and where you can see where power comes and collides, where it locks and interlocks. And the second being, all inequality is not created equal. So how then can intersectional theory be applied to classics? In using intersectional theory, one can look at the classics with a new perspective, encompassing different overlaying facets of an individual's identity that has not been explored in past scholarship. Intersectional theory can also give an insight into the systems of discrimination in different societies. Through projects like this, we can begin the work of opening up the field to people and individuals who previously felt unincluded in the discipline. So I've noted down some classical examples of intersectional experiences that I've come across in my own reading. I'll highlight three of my favorites. The first being Attis from Catullus 64. A lay of interest appears when considering that Attis is a Greek in a Roman text. Then we must consider that he starts his journey as a man, but once he is castrated in Phrygia, he loses aspects of his masculinity and is characterized quite effeminately. Another example being Horace's Canidia, who is often commented upon in scholarship in regards to witchcraft. Instead, if we view Canidia as an elderly hypersexual woman, Horace's diatribe against her is charged with invective relating to her age, gender, and sexuality in tandem. I shall close off with hopefully a familiar figure to all of you, Cleopatra. In Latin literature, she is depicted as a villainous character with often jabs to her peculiar position as a female leader whose sexuality and ethnicity has made her infamous to this day. To focus on a singular text, the Perennialist was a comedy written by Plautus. It was probably written in the early 3rd century BC, whilst the Second Punic War was still in living memory. The Second Punic War raged from 218 BC to 201 BC. I've attached a brief plot summary given in the Loeb edition of the text as a brief summary, which I'll read out now. And I've also made a little family tree in order for you guys to follow along. A 7-year-old boy, Agorastocles, is kidnapped from Carthage. Having bought him, an old misogynist adopts him and makes him his heir. 2 female relatives of the young man, Adolphasium and Antirastillus, and their nurse Gidenis, are kidnapped. Lycus buys them and torments Agorastocles, who loves Adolphasium, but Agorastocles palms off his overseer with gold to implicate the pimp Lycus in theft. The Carthaginian Hanno comes and finds Agorastocles to be his nephew and recognizes his daughters whom he'd lost with the help of Gidenis. Essentially, the Perennialist revolves around Carthaginians who do not know they are Punic living in Calydon, Greece in a Roman comedy. Now that already leads to an interesting dynamic when considering how these different ethnicities and nationalities will interact. Next, let's add that 3 of these 5 Carthaginians in the play are female slaves, 2 of which are prostitutes. Then we arrive in the complex and interesting world of the Perennialists. Like I said, to ease some of the complexity, I've drawn out this little family tree with all the particular characters of interest. Hanno is our title character. He's Carthaginian, and he is the pious yet tricky father of Adolphasium and Antirastillus, and the uncle of Agorastocles. He's also the original owner of Gidenis and his daughter's nurse, who was kidnapped. Lycus is the pimp who owns Adolphasium, Antirastillus, and currently Gidenis, who is at odds with Agorastocles. Agorastocles is the young Carthaginian man who was kidnapped and sold to a citizen of Calydon. He is in love with Adolphasium, although he was born Punic. He was raised Caledonian and identifies as such. He is also the master of the tricky slave, Milphio. So I listed some of the important points that I've observed in my thesis, but for the sake of brevity, I'll only focus on 2 of those. I've also highlighted the facets of identity that intersect in each of these instances, if anyone is interested. So I'd first like to draw on Adolphasium and Antirastillus and their identities as slave women. Throughout the play, their identity is very much torn up with the fact that they are prostitutes who have not yet lost their virginity. Especially the fact that they're prostitutes implicates them within their sexual identity, but also in combination with class and gender as slave women. But as Carthaginians, race is also connected very deeply, but they don't realize this until the second half of the play. So as that, due to that, there is a whole recognition of their identity. I'd also like to bring up the second, well, not the second, but the 4th bullet point there about Antirastillus being referred to as an African lover girl. This also happens in the second part of the play after it is kind of discovered and revealed that she is Carthaginian. I think it's quite important to note here that being of African descent was noted and was part of distinctive characteristic of how we view her in this part of the play. So where does the future lie? The future of intersectional theory and classics could hold a project which examines other pieces of Latin literature. I'm extremely happy to say that I will be starting my PhD this September at UCL, which will explore intersectional theory and Latin poetry of the Custom Hinge. That's the 1st centuries BC and AD. I hope to show in that project how the Latin literature of a period of immense change from republic to empire treats characters on the fringes of society. In having projects like this, we can gauge the classics and classical literature with a new perspective, creating more knowledge and interest for future classicists. Finally, I'd just like to conclude and say that intersectional theory allows us to view the classics with an understanding that we cannot simply read characters with a singular mode of difference. In order to understand why they are being marginalized in text, it's important to explore different facets of their own identities. The Perennialist is a text which enables one to read with intersectional theory in mind because of the overlapping references to race, sexuality, gender, and class. Yet this can be done for so many other classical texts. Whatever you're reading, I urge you to read with the understanding that, as Crenshaw said, all inequality is not created equal. Thank you for listening. I've put down my email just in case anyone has any questions later on, and I'm ready to answer any questions that may have arisen.
Thank you so much, Antonia. That was really, really interesting. Really fascinating.
Thank you.
And yeah, I would urge people to put their questions into the chat. Does anyone have any questions they want to ask before I forge ahead? Okay. A question I wanted to ask is, when did you first come across the Poenulus? Because I've never heard of it until your presentation just now. And why did you choose it above the other texts which exhibit intersectionality?
So the Perennialist, I personally first came across it in the beginning of my master's, actually through my supervisor, because I was very much planning on working on like Augustan literature, as it's one of my favourite periods. But I also wanted to focus on one particular text, and I knew that if I worked on anything in the Augustan period, I wouldn't be able to do so. My supervisor, Dr. Liz Gloyn, actually recommended me looking at the Perennialist, as she's looking at that currently, and I absolutely fell in love with it. It's very humorous considering it's an ancient play, and sometimes some of the jokes get interpreted. But I also think reading it gave me a great insight into how it appears in the ancient world, without the social categories that we are familiar with today. Your second question was regarding why didn't I choose the other ones? I think I already answered that, but essentially I wanted to be able to focus on one particular text, and I wanted to have a kind of launching point for a larger project, and I knew that focusing on all of Augustan literature would be far too great for an MA thesis. So that's why I'm quite excited to say that I will be working on that at UCL.
Yeah, no, awesome. Also, UCL, fantastic choice. Obviously, I had another question, which would be, so you mentioned how intersectionality should be kind of incorporated into the discipline as a whole, and it's a great way to sort of look at text and make classics sort of more accessible. Do you have any ideas kind of like more practically about how it can be incorporated and what kind of change you'd want to see within the discipline that would kind of incorporate intersectional theory?
I think it's more of an understanding that that we need to look at text and look at characters in the classical world with more of an understanding that there are overlaying differences in one's personality. For example, when there's lots of scholarship that's dedicated just to slavery or just to women and feminist readings, but there within the actual discourse there's less connecting the two, and understanding that someone can be marginalized and put in a further position of disadvantage by having both characteristics. And I think understanding the teaching as well to make students understand that you can look at a person's identity through more than one gaze, I think is going to be super important for future scholarship.